Hey everyone, welcome back to Plainclothes Faith. I'm Nick, and I'm really glad you're here. Over the last few episodes, we've been walking through some of the more difficult spaces in the life of faith. What happens when the story moves slower than expected? What happens when doubts begin to surface? What happens when God feels distant? And if you've walked through those kinds of seasons, you know what often comes next: uncertainty. Not just about how you feel, but about where you're going, what's ahead, what God is doing with your life. And if we're honest, that kind of uncertainty can feel unsettling because we don't just want to trust God in theory. We want to understand where things are headed. We want clarity, direction, some sense that we're moving in the right way. But there are seasons where that clarity just isn't there, where the next step isn't obvious, where the future feels unclear. And in those moments, faith is no longer about understanding the plan. It becomes about trusting God without seeing it. And that kind of trust is not easy because it requires us to move forward without having everything figured out. And if we're honest, that goes against how most of us naturally operate. We want to know, we want to plan, we want to be sure. But scripture shows us something different. It shows us people who followed God without knowing exactly where they were going. And one of the clearest examples of this kind of faith is Abraham. At the very beginning of his story, God speaks to him with a command, not a full plan, not a detailed outline, just a direction. Genesis 12:1, we see this. Go from your country and your kindred and your father's house to the land that I will show you. That phrase matters, that I will show you, not that I have already shown you, not that you fully understand, but something that will be revealed as you go. If you really think about that moment, there's a lot that's left unsaid. There's no timeline, no map, and no clear picture of what that land even looks like, just a direction and a promise that hasn't been fulfilled yet, which means Abraham had to sit in something uncomfortable. Uncertainty. He knows he's supposed to go, but that he doesn't fully know where that will lead. And that space between calling and clarity is where faith actually begins. Because it's one thing to follow God when you understand the outcome. It's another thing entirely to follow him when you don't. And if you pause there, you start to see what kind of trust this requires. Abraham is being asked to move forward without knowing exactly where he's going, to leave what is familiar for something that has not yet been fully revealed. And that's uncomfortable because most of us don't struggle to follow directions. We struggle to follow direction when the destination is unclear. But Abraham goes, not because everything makes sense, not because he has all the answers, but because he trusts the one who is leading him. And that moment becomes one of the most defining pictures of faith in all of Scripture. In fact, in Hebrews 11, it's described in this way in verse 8. By faith, Abraham obeyed when he was called to go out to a place that he was to receive as an inheritance. And he went out, not knowing where he was going. That line is everything, not knowing where he was going. That's not a side detail. That's the whole point. Because faith in that moment was not about clarity, it was about trust, trusting God without having the full picture. And that's exactly what makes seasons of uncertainty so difficult because we want to move forward with confidence, with understanding, with a clear sense of direction. But often, God invites us to move forward with something else: trust, not in the plan, but in Him. And that's a very, very different kind of faith. It's not built on knowing everything, it's built on knowing enough to take the next step. And if we're honest, this is where uncertainty becomes difficult, not just because we don't know what's next, but because of what that uncertainty does inside of us. It creates tension, questions, sometimes even anxiety. Because when the future is unclear, we start trying to fill in the gaps ourselves. We try to figure it all out. We try to plan it out, control the outcome. We run through all the possibilities in our heads. What if this happened? What if I choose wrong? What if I miss something that God is trying to show me? And the more we sit in that, the more it starts to feel like everything depends on us. Like if we just think hard enough, plan carefully enough, we'll be able to figure it all out. But underneath that, there's usually something deeper: a desire for control. Not because we're trying to replace God, but because the uncertainty feels vulnerable. It feels exposed. It reminds us that we don't actually know what's coming next. And that's difficult because control gives us a sense of stability, even if it's illusion. But faith begins to move us in a different direction, not towards more control, but towards deeper trust. And over time, that pressure can begin to build because now it's not just about trusting God. It feels like we're responsible for getting everything right. And that's heavy because it makes faith feel like a test. Like one wrong decision could throw everything off. But when you look at scripture, That's not how God leads. He doesn't demand perfect foresight, He invites faithful steps. And that is an important shift because it means the goal is not to figure out your entire future. The goal is to trust God with your next step. And yes, that sounds simple, but it's not always easy because letting go of control feels like risk. It feels like stepping forward without guarantees. And that's where another voice speaks into this. Theologian Soren Kierkegaard. Kierkegaard describes faith as something that requires a kind of inward surrender, not blind belief, but a willingness to trust God, even when certainty is not available. He once described it as a kind of leap, not a leap into nothing, but a step beyond what you can fully see or prove. And that idea can feel uncomfortable because we prefer solid ground, clear answers, defined outcomes. But faith often asks us to move forward without those things. That doesn't mean we're being careless. It means we're learning to trust God more than our ability to predict what comes next. And over time, that kind of trust begins to reshape something inside of us. Not immediately, not all at once, but we gradually begin to loosen our grip on control. We begin to realize that we were never meant to carry the full weight of our future. And that realization creates a space for trust, a space for peace, even in the middle of uncertainty. And that's where this kind of faith begins to take shape. Not when everything is clear, but when it's not. Not when you have the full picture, but when you don't. Because trusting God with the future is not about having certainty, it's about learning how to move forward without it. And scripture meets us there, not with a detailed map, but with something steady, something we can return to when the future feels unclear. It begins with this taking the next step, not 10 steps ahead, not the entire path, just the next one. Because most of the time, God doesn't reveal the whole journey. He gives enough light for what's right in front of you. And as you take that step, something else begins to grow trust, not in your ability to figure everything out, but in God's ability to lead you, even when you don't see where it's going. And over time, that trust begins to change how you carry uncertainty. It doesn't remove it, but it steadies you in the middle of it. Because now your confidence is not in knowing what comes next, it's in knowing who's with you in it. And that shift is subtle, but it's powerful because it frees you from the pressure of trying to control what you were never meant to control. And it allows you to live with open hands, to move forward without needing everything to be resolved first. And if we're honest, this is where many of us live, not with total clarity, not with complete certainty, but somewhere in between, where we know enough to keep going, but not enough to feel fully settled. And maybe that's not a problem to solve. Maybe it's an invitation to trust God, not just at the end of the story, but in the middle of it. Because if we're honest, this is where the tension really lives, not just in what we believe about God, but in how we move forward when we don't have clarity, when we don't feel certain, when we're not completely sure what the right decision is. And learning to live there, learning to move forward without having everything resolved. That's where faith becomes steady, not because the path is clear, but because we trust the one who is leading us on it. So here's a simple challenge for this week. Think about one area of your life where the future feels unclear, where you've been waiting for clarity, waiting for direction, and waiting to feel sure. And instead of trying to figure everything out, ask a different question. God, what is the next step in front of me? Not the full plan, not the final outcome, just the next step. And then take it faithfully, not because you have all the answers, but because you trust the one who is leading you. Because faith is not about seeing the whole path. It's about walking forward one step at a time and trusting that God will meet you there. And in the next episode, we're going to continue this conversation because when we take that next step, even when we begin to trust, there are still moments when we look back and wonder if we've made the right choices. So next week, we'll talk about how to deal with regret and how to trust God with the paths we've already taken. Thanks for walking with me on Playing Close. No hype, no shortcuts, just faithful steps one day at a time.